Lower the microphone.
Cheers, Tom. I was just thinking after Malin's presentation, this could be the first time that the microphone actually got raised for my presentation, but it's hard to say. You know, I think we're right about the same size. We're not going to be splitting hairs on that one, that's for sure. Yeah, some really good presentations, and this ties into Anna's talk quite well. Actually segues into that, and a little bit related to Mark's, although Mark's is more technique oriented. But what I've put together here is a little bit about the ECT and some what I think is pretty relevant research for everybody to be aware of, and that's pretty much why I picked this topic. I thought it's pretty, I think I put in the description as compelling evidence of recent tests and tying the ECT to interpretation of stability is how they've termed it, and I think you'll find those things interesting. And then I've tied it also to the application and limitations that we come across when we're doing tests. And then lastly, some of my own thoughts about the terrain choice decisions that you make given the information that you've got and some of those limitations. So that's what I've got in mind here. The ECT is about 15 years old now. 2006, Ron Siminois and Carl Birkeland devised this test as trying to find a test that, as you know, is really helpful for determining propagation, and which was directly linked to initiation and ultimately fracture of avalanches. Those fellas were here in 2008 and introduced that test along with Jordi Hendricks on one of the first redeveloped stage 2 that we put together from Canada in that year. And there's a few people in this room that were present at that and part of that. So it was really great to have those guys here and sharing that with us. But as a 15-year-old test, and it's what now might be its adolescent stages, it's looking to kind of expand its horizons, and I think it's done that pretty effectively in that it's one of the most widely used tests internationally, and New Zealand's no exception to that. The paper, so I'm pretty much just telling you stuff that somebody else did. It's pretty easy. And if there's complicated questions, I won't be able to answer them. I can just go, ask these guys. But this is the source of the paper. It was primarily out of Switzerland with Frank Teckel, but Carl was involved along with Ron, as I mentioned, and Doug Chabot from Gallatin in Montana, and also a couple of fellows I don't know, Jim Earl and Ivan Moner were also involved in this, and it's quite recent. It's just last year, and the findings were published in the Avalanche Review in October last year, and I've talked with Brad Carpenter, and this should be in the first issue of the Avalanche Dispatch, this information, so it'll be out there for folks that weren't able to attend this as well. And I think what makes this these findings most relevant is some of the, when I say compelling results, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that this stuff was done using a huge data set. It's like 3782 ECTs that were selected out of 30,000, a data set of 30,000. Now that's a lot less than Simon uses, the billions and billions, but it's a lot more than Hugh Bernard uses. So put it somewhere in between. But they selected that data set based on ECT results done on slopes that they considered to be stable or unstable by a fairly robust means. And this is how they describe those things. It's basically instability signs that were obvious there. So they either had cracking or one thing or recent avalanches. So things that you could pretty much hang your hat on were clearly unstable slopes, or stable would have been the lack of those signs, plus they got skied. In the US, they ended up getting skied as well. As a result, the overall bias on the tests where they were at 32% were unstable, and is that 68 were stable. It's so small on my screen I can't see it, but without putting my glasses back and forth. So that formed the basis of how they described, used the test and put it in a data set. There's a lot of data, and they only used the data that was associated with places that had clear signs of instability or stability by those criteria. So using nearly 4,000 data points of that kind of thing is quite useful. Now, this I put in here because it's a conference and it has to do with research. So so I thought I'd put a graph up here that nobody could possibly see from their seat, the detail. I think that's quite important too. But what this shows, I'll talk about the results in a minute, but this is more about the where the information came from and the consistency of results between the US data set, which is the snow pilot one on the left, and the Swiss results. The US results were like 2,500 pits, and the Swiss results were about 1,200. So those larger data sets had fairly similar results, where the ones from Spain that were also used, they only had like 167 or something like that they used. And so you see more spikes in the results there, but there's an overall trend that was somewhat similar. So this is kind of more the gist of what happened. So they shown in a single graph, really. So the dotted line across there, that's what delineates the stable and unstable. So that's like your clearly unstable slopes were put below that line. Clearly unstable slopes were put above that line, and those are all the test points that were done. And what it shows, which this is not rocket science, I think anybody in this room would probably go, yep, that's probably what I'd expect, is that when you get very easy results or easy results, so with your ECTs, if we're talking about positive results, that the slopes are very unstable. And as the more taps that you require to get an ECTP, still a positive propagation, the closer that is to not making a huge difference. Put it another way. This part is what's come out here. So they basically observed ECTPs more often on unstable slopes, or ECTVs, and then I'm kind of assuming with this audience that everybody knows what these mean, but the V is very easy propagation, and P means it was positive for propagation, and it just depends. The V's mean you approached it and didn't even tap on it, and you might have been cutting the block and it failed, where P's are that progressive tapping from the wrist, elbow, shoulder that Mark was demonstrating out there. And then ECTNs and ECTXs, that's pretty intuitive too. You're not getting cracking, or you're not getting a positive result go across the column, or you didn't get a crack at all, but you might have had a crack that didn't propagate. We think of that as being more stable. And then, what's the last one? ECTs with higher number taps seem to be more stable. So all that's pretty, pretty intuitive. This is the thing that came out of this study that's probably the most relevant stuff, and the whole point I wanted to share really, is that it said that ECTPs, it starts to, and this is why I've called it splitting hairs, because now all of a sudden, we're getting into taking an ECTP, which, should be a red flag for you in when you get it, and saying, well, if it's less than 14, then you should really have your hackles up, because it's clearly unstable. And that's what all those clusters in the upper left part of that graph was about. between 14 and 22, that is on a sliding scale that you might, some of the slopes were associated with instability and some weren't. And by the time you get to 22, you're on about a 50-50 chance whether those slopes are actually stable or unstable, according to this. And so the test is a bit less conclusive for instability or stability at that range, greater than 22. Likewise, when you get an ECTN, you get a crack on anything over than the 8th tap, or you don't get any cracks at all, that's more of a tendency towards good stability. When you have the ones that are less than 8, you get a crack, on the 3rd tap from your wrist, that's more closely linked to fair stability in around, and it's similar to the greater than 22 taps when you get a positive result. So, so this is all about this is the stability of the snow. I personally, it's taken so long to change our words in the hazard review on a daily basis to get rid of the word stability, that I personally would rather see you talk about the instability in the snow, because this is an instability test ultimately. It will show you instabilities. It hopefully, most of the time, will show you instabilities when they exist. And so I'm presenting the paper, which is, they talk about poor, fair, and good, and I just would love to see that just translated a little further in the way we speak about instability of the snowpack. And kind of leave it away from, try not to link that to hazard, because you need to have consequence along with this to create a hazard. This is really just the instability in the snow itself. So that's just my own little thing I added in there. But here's your pocket guide. If you want to take a picture of something, this kind of is the summary of this chat, really, in terms of something you can use in the field. I could see taking a dive and that was my big chance for getting everybody's photo, but I kind of blew that. So this just kind of lays it out. And I didn't bother changing the verbiage like I just talked about, but I think everybody can relate to the old words because we always did talk about stability. There's a lot of folks in this room that are super familiar with that. If you kind of came through your training recently, that may have been touched on, or maybe not, because it's pretty much, we don't really talk about that much anymore. But hopefully you can relate that to the what we do talk about now. So what was this one about? I might need my glasses for this. So this was just a summary, taking that thing on the other page and pulling the numbers out and just giving you the overall thing to help you remember, basically, what those particular things mean. And so some of the key numbers in that, if you're going to try to remember this whole thing, were 8, 14, and 22, and then try to figure out where they go in the whole spectrum. But really, those are the only 3 numbers that are relevant with your ECTs and your P's and your N's. P's and Q's, and mind you. So I just want to talk about limitations as well, as I mentioned that earlier. And this is a tricky one with all tests. And one of the huge challenges for people doing them, and why it's pretty difficult for folks on a 2-day course or a 4-day course or even a week-long course to really develop these skills, because they do take time. As part of my work, I train people coming on the upper level as well as the entry-level pro courses here. And often we bring them to a slope and say, you got 10 minutes to gather some information here. And I like to do this early in the course and see where people go on the slope, because it's so critical to actually getting valid information. And then after we get it, we compare results, and then we talk about what's relevant, and then we talk about where people selected those places to get their information, and how the terrain may have modified the snowpack in that location, and therefore influenced your result. Often we see people digging just below the ridge top where the wind has been gone over the top and eddied in and just compacted the snow super strong, and it's not very it's not a good indicator for instabilities lower down in the slope. So that's a really common one. You know, the whole idea when we're out there is trying to find the sweet spot, right? So giving that a lot of consideration is even amongst people who've been doing it a while. It's not that straightforward, and is a tricky thing. So just to have somebody do a test, it actually can work the other way, because if you're hanging your hat on your test, which hopefully you're not, and it tells you that it's good to go, and you're digging in a wind-packed ridge, you're probably getting the wrong information that's going to influence your decision, you know, in the wrong way. So back to the thing all about selecting the right location. That's a big one. It's a time. It just takes time. It's, you know, I think that's a Bruce Jameson line. You know, it's been doing this 40 years, and you just have to be patient. You know, you learn every day when you're out there. And then, you know, think about, you know, for the place that you're digging, I guess this kind of ties in the same thing. Think about, you know, how that that location is being affected by everything in and around that. You know, the wind, the amount of snow that's actually there, features that may be under the snow that may be affecting it, and think about the variability amongst the terrain as well. Another thing we do on courses sometimes is just probe right across, or we'll pull up to a spot and say, guess what the snowpack depth is across the slope, and then we'll probe for it and see how close you are, or drawing a snowpack, just some representative, just by looking at it and trying to think about the layering that's in it from what you've already observed, or even maybe your forecast. So that's the third point, as part of understanding that spatial variability, is a single test with stable results should never be used solely for, you know, making your call. I can't say that enough, you know. And what we do generally is we try to get a really good idea, and I think Hugh was talking about this. This is just part and parcel of the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, you know, that Grant Statham and folks put up is, you know, you sit in isolation without all the distractions of a beautiful slope in front of you in the morning or the night before, and try to make decisions on what you think the hazard is, which is, as Anna referred to, as your hypothesis. And then when you're going out there, you're trying to gather evidence for that hypothesis to confirm it or challenge it. And so you should have a pretty good idea before you go, you know, so just digging out there. And it sounded like a lot of people were doing that with Anna's presentation. You know, they knew what the hazard was, but they were missing gathering that evidence to confirm that or challenge it. And again, unless you're practiced at it, you might be getting the wrong information from that. So I guess you have to, it's a tricky one. You need, that's where mentoring is really handy, I think. So, you know, we're trying to always combine that information. And I was also referring, I've never really seen a percentage associated with the value of the test, but, you know, she identified 10 or 15%. And I think it's just a great, it doesn't matter if it's that or 25. The key thing is that you want to use other information to verify stability, you know, and that should be that whole thing. I haven't seen any cracking, I haven't seen any avalanching, I haven't had any womping. Another thing we do is, as we're constantly moving, we're always probing with our pole for inversions in the snowpack and the depth, you know, because that is back to consequence. It's not just about the layer, but this all always ties back to the avalanche problem of concern, and so that's why that's part of the conceptual model. Is you need to know what the nature of the beast is you're dealing with, so you can properly look for it and test for it, and then also mitigate it properly, or make those choices to do that. And then, on the other hand, a single test, that is a corollary of it. If you ever do get these positive ECT results, that should be the one that makes you go, yep, she's dangerous out there right now, you know. And being able to take that information on board, there is sometimes not that easy, you know. This is where all those other pressures where you're out there kind of can come into play. You know, confirmation bias, you look for things that results that you want to accept because it helps you do the things you want to do, which is go have fun in the POW, and you might ignore the things like a big warning sign like a ECTP and justify it somehow that that's not that important right now because maybe we're going over here. Oh, that was that test that happened over there. All right, let's go over here. Which might be a good choice because it's a different aspect and maybe more stable, but hopefully you go test that one first. So what else have I got? So this is you know, a bit of a takeaway on that conversation really in terms of doing a second ECT. So this was right out of that paper. This isn't my babble. Is that when you have that mid-range ECT between you know, 14 and 22, or greater than 14, I guess, is just the way to look at that. You get any ECTP. If it's less than 14, it's clearly unstable or very often linked to instability, and or you get an ECT. Is that 10? Is that the recommendation? Yeah, I guess that's combining all the data and being on the conservative side there. You know, you could argue that that's less than 8 or equal to 8, that you could do that. But if you're in that ground, you get those results, that's a good place to do a second test to get you, because that's, you're basically on the middle ground, stable or unstable, and a second test can really help with your decision making on whether what you think it actually is. So this is another good slide to take a picture of this time. What's that? Yes, actually the same location, or within the location. You want to take another picture?
Do you just want to stand short? You just want to stand
I could do that. Now I'm going to be in everybody's photo. 5 minutes, great. No, that's perfect. Now I got to do that, right? Yeah. Oh, that's too quick. No, I actually have to go back and look at my notes for this one. You can see I practice this extensively.
So good.
Thanks. This is my 2 cents, and in closing, we'll do some questions. And I think I just alluded to this. Your AVI forecast is as good as your weather forecast, and you know, and what you based it on. I mean, that is what you based it on. And it is a hypothesis. So your job, once in the field, is to gather evidence to confirm or challenge the hypothesis. And all snowpack tests form one part of the evidence, and results should be consistent with other field obs. Once in the field, consider the avalanche problem type and the micro features on the slope, as they may affect not only the test results but also the triggering ability. And I use this. I thought about when this is an issue. And if you take this, what I've just told you, and say, oh, well, you know, it's, I got an ECT P27, you know, down right near the threshold. It's maybe 90 centimeters down. Fair stability. It's not too bad. using this new criteria. But what I want you to think about is that's where you did your test, and you might be then rolling in to a steep head wall that's rocky, that's quite a bit thinner, and that sweet spot is no longer a 27, but it's more like a 10. And then that propagates out to much deeper terrain in and around you, and you got a big avalanche on your hands. So, you know, it might be hard to trigger, but if you can find the sweet spot, you're going to trigger it. So, you know, I think I put this thing out there because this is saying you can thread the needle a little bit tighter, but I think you got to be super confident with that call, or I just don't put my kind of confidence in tests like that. You know, just if I get a positive result, that's a huge warning sign for me, and I kind of back away from gnarly terrain or terrain with consequence. So you got to tie in the consequence. So I think I've got that in there. So hedge your bets anytime when you do have any kind of ECTP result, and consider the consequence. I mean, you could get that result, you know, an ECTP 2027, and go, oh, sweet, I'm just going to go over here where it's a lesser angle slope, or it fans out, or I've got clear escape routes, or the depth of failure isn't as much. So there are ways to manage it. And then the obvious thing is to make sure everybody, and I think it's easy as a guide going, God, if this fails, I know I'm going that way. But, you know, just make sure everybody's on board with what the results were, what they actually mean, and everybody knows how to get out of the way. And that might not be anything, yeah, I know how to do that, but you watch them ski and you're thinking, maybe not, you know. So there's a lot of things at play if you're making these decisions for others, I think. The greater uncertainty of snowpack, you know, just put a greater margin of safety with a terrain choice. I think you might have heard that a million times. If the question is snowpack, the answer is always terrain or terrain choice, and I think has a lot to do with I've got the privilege of being old. So there you go. It's worked so far for me. So yeah, that's I think about me. Any questions?
Let's give Pete a round of applause first. Yep. Thanks, Pete. Any questions for Pete? No? Anyone? No? Okay.
Cool.
No questions. Great. Thanks, Pete.